You know, imagine just waking up tomorrow morning to a massive, systemic financial shock. Out of nowhere, all that liquidity sitting in your bank account, it's practically meaningless.
You head down to the grocery store, and thanks to hyperinflation, the cost of everyday basics has literally doubled overnight. And the gas you need just to commute to work? Completely unaffordable.
Meanwhile, businesses are laying people off left and right. Stock markets are in an absolute free fall, and those massive financial institutions you've trusted with your life savings, they're starting to crack and collapse.
Now, I know that sounds like some extreme doomsday stress test scenario, but looking at the macroeconomic data right now, well, this kind of visceral shock, it's really no longer just hypothetical. We're looking at a deeply interconnected financial system that's showing some real stress fractures. And if it breaks, millions could lose everything they've worked for.
Which brings us to the absolute core question. Are we truly barreling toward a massive global recession? One that could actually eclipse the 2008 financial crash? Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're going to put on our economist hats and objectively unpack the structural risks that are currently threatening the global economy.
Okay, let's dive right in. We've got 5 key areas to cover today. 1. Echoes of past crises. 2. Today's structural debt risks. 3. Geopolitics and global trade. 4. The new digital landscape. And 5. The psychology of panic.
Section 1. Echoes of past crises.
So our modern global economy basically runs on the assumption of predictable stability. But when we look back at historical inflection points, there's a pretty clear, scary pattern of what happens when that stability shatters. Think back to the Great Depression in the 1930s. Systemic banking failures literally wiped out the savings of millions. Fast forward a few decades, and the 2008 global financial crisis showed us how highly leveraged housing loans could trigger a worldwide panic, nearly taking down giant financial institutions. And then, of course, 2020. The COVID-19 pandemic just halted global trade altogether. Governments responded by printing unprecedented amounts of fiat currency. It was a temporary fix, sure, but it really set the stage for the fragility we're seeing today.
Section 2. Today's structural debt risks.
Right, let's talk about the macro pressures we're dealing with right now. As we all know, when inflation spikes, money loses its purchasing power rapidly. To fight this off, central banks, like the U.S. Federal Reserve, pull out their primary weapon, hiking up interest rates to cool down demand. But this is an incredibly dangerous balancing act. Making borrowing more expensive inherently strangles business growth, and it seriously threatens to burst housing bubbles in the process.
And compounding all of that inflation is a frankly terrifying reality. Trillions of dollars in structural debt. Governments all over the world heavily leverage themselves to fund their post-pandemic recoveries. So now, the United States and many emerging markets are carrying unprecedented sovereign debt to GDP ratios. If economic growth stagnates, well, just servicing that debt becomes way more expensive because of those high interest rates we just talked about. Nations will default. The global financial system is essentially acting like a bridge that's starting to crack under its own immense weight.
Moving on to Section 3, Geopolitics and Global Trade.
Economic structures don't just exist in a vacuum, right? They're highly vulnerable to international relations. And we're witnessing a super dangerous domino effect right now. The Russia-Ukraine war has drastically disrupted agricultural exports and sent energy costs surging. Meanwhile, tensions in the Middle East are threatening crucial maritime trade routes and oil markets. And simultaneously, China, which has long been the engine of global manufacturing, is dealing with a severe real estate crisis and massive youth unemployment. Because our global supply chains are wound so tight, a shock in any one of these regions creates a massive, immediate ripple effect everywhere else.
All right, Section 4, the new digital landscape.
You really can't forecast a future recession without understanding how technology has completely altered the mechanics of a financial crisis. Back in the 1930s, or even in 2008, financial panics were mostly tied to physical assets. People literally lining up on the sidewalk outside brick-and-mortar banks or local factories shutting their doors. Today, the landscape is entirely digital. Now we're exposed to things like instant cryptocurrency liquidations, algorithmic flash crashes, and global cybercrime that can wipe out billions in institutional wealth overnight. The next big bank run isn't going to happen on a sidewalk, it's going to happen right on a smartphone.
And then you have to factor in the AI revolution. Artificial intelligence definitely promises a massive leap in corporate productivity, absolutely. But it also brings a very real threat of rapid structural unemployment. If millions of white-collar livelihoods are displaced faster than new sectors can absorb them, consumer spending is going to plummet. And that just adds a whole new thick layer of instability to the global economy.
Which brings us to Section 5, the psychology of panic.
Because at the end of the day, economics isn't just a bunch of spreadsheets. It's fundamentally driven by human behavior. Let's look at how a psychological cascade actually accelerates a crash. Step 1. Public fear sets in over a piece of bad news, maybe a regional banking failure or a global conflict. Step 2. Driven by that uncertainty, everyday consumers start hoarding cash and stop spending, while businesses completely freeze their hiring. Step 3. That sudden drop in aggregate demand turns what could have been a minor correction into a full-blown market collapse. You see, confidence is the bedrock of fiat currency. Once that confidence fractures, the whole mathematical model just unravels.
And we really have to acknowledge the devastating human toll this takes. Economic crises severely amplify inequality. The wealthy, they often survive recessions just fine because they hold protected assets and diversified investments. But the poor and the middle class are the ones crushed by rising food and housing costs. When millions of people are living paycheck to paycheck and suddenly lose their primary income, history shows us pretty clearly that this level of desperation rapidly leads to social unrest, crime, and political extremism.
So bringing this all together, we are witnessing a truly unprecedented convergence of global risks right now. Inflation pressures, a massive structural debt explosion, multiple concurrent wars, energy crises, and rising political tensions, literally all happening at the exact same time. And because our modern economies are so deeply connected, a problem in one hemisphere can spread internationally within hours, shaking financial markets all over the globe. Look, nobody knows exactly what's going to happen next, but the global economy is clearly entering one of the most uncertain periods in modern history, which leaves us with this final thought to ponder. If world leaders fail to relieve this growing pressure, will the next great crisis begin inside our banks, our businesses, and our households instead of on a battlefield? Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and I encourage you to keep questioning the numbers behind our fragile global economy.